2 in the morning. The dark, frigid waters of the Ofot-fjord in northern Norway. The destroyer USS Gravely was at anchor, but its electronic eyes were wide awake. Something was moving against the steel of the hull, and it was not the natural pull of the tide. The air above the fjord was biting, smelling of pine and ancient ice. Below the waterline, the hull was a wall of black iron, in a silent, freezing world where an intruder had just made a calculated, dangerous move. Inside the Combat Information Center of the destroyer, DDG-107, the atmosphere shifted from the low hum of a routine night watch to the sharp electric tension of a contact. Sonar technician Second Class Miller stared at his display, his headset pressed tight against his ears. The high-frequency diver detection sonar, a specialized system designed to find small objects in cluttered coastal environments, was sending back a series of sharp, irregular returns. The signals were concentrated near the stern of the ship, specifically around the massive bronze propellers and the rudder assembly. These were not the rhythmic pulses of a school of fish or the erratic noise of drifting kelp. These were hard, metallic reflections that moved with a terrifyingly human precision. Miller keyed his microphone, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the discovery. He reported to the officer of the deck that the ship had multiple submerged contacts directly on the hull. Within seconds, the bridge was alive. Commander Sarah Vance, the commanding officer of the USS Gravely, arrived in the Combat Information Center less than 3 minutes after the initial report. She did not need to be told the gravity of the situation. A billion-dollar United States Navy asset was sitting still in a narrow fjord, and someone was currently touching the skin of her ship. The sensor data was fed into the primary tactical display. The Kingfisher, high-frequency, sonar showed 4 distinct shapes clinging to the hull, approximately 10 meters below the surface. They were positioned in pairs. One pair was near the starboard shaft, while the second pair was tucked into the shadow of the rudder. They were using magnetic rebreathers, which meant they were not releasing any bubbles that might be seen from the surface. They were ghosts in the water, or at least they were intended to be. The ship's internal security system was immediately upgraded to Security Alert. This was not a general battle station call that would alert everyone in the fjord with sirens, but a quiet, lethal transition. The ship's security force, armed with M4 carbines and M9 pistols, moved through the passageways in soft-soled boots. They took up positions at every railing and every deck opening that overlooked the water. Commander Vance ordered the activation of the ship's external lighting. Massive halogen searchlights erupted from the discedite superstructure, tearing through the Norwegian darkness and turning the surface of the fjord into a field of brilliant, shimmering white. The water was so clear that the light penetrated deep into the emerald depths, but the divers were tucked far beneath the curve of the hull, hidden by the very ship they were targeting. The tactical situation was unprecedented. The USS Gravely was in the sovereign waters of Norway, a NATO ally, but the intruders were almost certainly from the Russian Federation's elite Spetsnaz naval units operating out of the Northern Fleet. For the Russians to put divers on a United States destroyer while it was at anchor was an act of extreme provocation. It was a message that no ship was safe, even in a protected harbor. Below the waterline, the temperature was a bone-chilling 2 degrees Celsius. The divers were wearing advanced dry suits, but the cold would still be a factor. More importantly, they were now trapped. They knew the ship had detected them. They could feel the pulses of the sonar hitting their bodies like physical blows, a sensation that every combat diver loathes. The sonar pings were not just for detection. They were a warning that the Americans were watching. On the bridge, the radio began to crackle with encrypted traffic. The United States European Command in Stuttgart and the Norwegian Coast Guard were being briefed in real time. The orders from the Pentagon were clear: protect the ship at all costs, but avoid an international incident unless fired upon. However, protection was a broad term when 4 hostile divers were attached to the rudder of a guided missile destroyer. Commander Vance looked at the clock. It was now 2:15 in the morning. The standoff had officially begun. The crew of the USS Gravely was prepared for a fight, but the enemy was not a ship on the horizon or a missile in the air. The enemy was a few men in black rubber suits, holding on to the hull of the ship with magnetic grips, waiting for a signal that might never come. The silence of the fjord was deceptive. Above the water, the mountains stood like silent sentinels, and the wind whispered through the rigging of the ship. But below, the surface, the USS Gravely and the Russian Spetsnaz were locked in a cold, deadly embrace. The next 4 hours would determine if this would be a footnote in a diplomatic cable or the beginning of a shooting war in the North Atlantic. 2:18 in the morning. The internal atmosphere of the destroyer DDG-107 shifted from a state of watchful peace to a calculated, high-intensity readiness. The ship's general quarters alarm did not blare with the chaotic sirens of a past era. Instead, the electronic chimes pulsed 3 times, a steady, rhythmic bong bong bong, followed by the calm but firm voice of the boatswain's mate of the watch. Over the ship-wide announcing system, he announced that the ship was at general quarters, and for all hands to provide for the Steiner condition of readiness throughout the ship. In the narrow, dimly lit passageways, the crew of the USS Gravely moved with the practiced precision of 1,000 drills. There was no shouting, only the heavy thud of boots on non-skid deck plating and the metallic clatter of heavy steel hatches being swung shut and dogged down. Each click of a lever was a seal against the outside world, turning the destroyer into a series of watertight, airtight honeycombs. The air inside the ship began to smell of ozone, recycled oxygen, and the faint, underlying scent of hydraulic fluid. The ventilation systems transitioned to a closed-loop cycle, a standard precaution against chemical or biological threats, further isolating the sailors from the freezing Norwegian night. Outside, in the Combat Information Center, Commander Vance watched the status board as every station reported in. Bridge, manned and ready. Engineering, manned and ready. Weapons, manned and ready. Within 6 minutes, the USS Gravely was a fully realized instrument of war. Every one of its 300-plus sailors, at their designated post, fingers hovering over consoles or gripping the stocks of their weapons. Launch the remote-operated vehicle, Commander Vance ordered. Her eyes never left the main tactical display. On the flight deck at the stern, a specialized team from the ship's engineering department deployed a Seabotics remote-operated vehicle. It was a compact, tethered drone roughly the size of a suitcase, equipped with high-definition low-light cameras and powerful thrusters. As it hit the water, the splash was swallowed instantly by the blackness of the fjord. The tether, a thin umbilical cord of fiber optic glass and copper, unspooled into the depths. In a small control booth adjacent to the flight deck, a technician manipulated a joystick, guiding the drone beneath the massive curve of the ship's hull. The video feed was patched directly to the large screens in the Combat Information Center. At first, there was only the greenish-black murk of the fjord, illuminated by the drone's onboard LED searchlights. Then, the massive, barnacle-free slab of the ship's steel hull came into view. The camera panned toward the stern. The ship's starboard propeller shaft, a massive cylinder of forged steel, looked like a cathedral pillar in the underwater gloom. And there, clinging to the metal, were the intruders. The resolution of the camera was sharp enough to see the texture of their suits. These were not recreational divers. They wore heavy, matte black, vulcanized rubber dry suits that absorbed the light. Their faces were obscured by full face masks integrated with Draeger-style oxygen rebreathers. These units recycled the diver's breath, scrubbed out the carbon dioxide, and added fresh oxygen, leaving no trail of telltale bubbles to rise to the surface. "Zoom in on the belt kits," Vance commanded. The technician adjusted the optics. On The hip of the lead diver was a specialized underwater propulsion vehicle, a small, handheld DPV that allowed them to transit long distances without exhausting themselves. More importantly, the divers were carrying heavy, rectangular bags made of reinforced nylon. One diver was currently using a magnetic pad to secure to himself to the hull, while the second diver reached into the bag and pulled out a device roughly the size of a lunchbox. Limpet mines, the tactical action officer whispered. "They aren't just watching us," Vance said, her voice dropping an octave. "They are mining the ship in a friendly port." The gravity of the situation hit the room like a physical shockwave. This was no longer a game of cat and mouse or a simple violation of territorial waters. It was an act of sabotage against a United States Navy vessel. If those mines detonated, they could tear through the propeller shafts or the rudder, deadlining the ship and potentially causing a catastrophic breach in the engineering spaces. Commander Vance picked up the secure handset to the bridge. She ordered the Security Reaction Force Alpha to the fantail. She also ordered the sonar team to begin active pinging at maximum safe frequency. While high-intensity sonar can be lethal to divers at close range, she wanted to send a non-lethal but unmistakable message. We see you, and we know exactly what you are doing. Outside, the fjord remained deceptively still. The only sound was the low, persistent throb of the ship's gas turbine generators. But deep beneath the waterline, the first pulses of active sonar began to hammer against the divers' bodies, a physical vibration that would feel like someone was punching them in the chest with every second that passed. The parasitic contacts had been identified, the ship was ready for war, and the first phase of the engagement was about to turn violent. 2:30 in the morning. Inside the secure communications suite of the destroyer DDG-107, the air was cool and smelled of ionized dust. Commander Vance stood before the tactical terminal, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the encrypted video link to United States European Command. In Stuttgart, Germany, the situation was being monitored in real time by the highest levels of the United States Navy and the Norwegian Ministry of Defense. At coordinates 68 degrees 26 minutes north, 17 degrees 24 minutes east, the USS Gravely was now the center of a geopolitical flashpoint that could ignite the entire North Atlantic. The Norwegian Coast Guard vessel KV Nordkapp was 10 miles out, pushing through the heavy swells of the outer fjord at 25 knots to provide sovereign support. However, the clock was working against them. The rules of engagement provided by the Pentagon were restrictive but clear. The ship possessed the inherent right of self-defense against an imminent threat of force. Under standard maritime law, the attachment of explosive devices to a sovereign vessel constituted an act of war, yet the diplomatic repercussions of killing Russian divers in Norwegian waters were potentially catastrophic. Vance briefed the admiral on the satellite link, her voice devoid of emotion as she described the 4 divers currently working on her ship's propulsion system. The intelligence officers in Stuttgart had already cross-referenced the high-definition images from the remote-operated vehicle, the matte black rebreathers, and the specific shape of the underwater propulsion vehicles matched the known inventory of the Russian Naval Spetsnaz, specifically the 731st Naval Special Reconnaissance Point. These were Tier 1 operators, the elite of the Russian Northern Fleet, trained specifically for deep-water sabotage and unconventional warfare. On the bridge, the officer of the deck watched the horizon through thermal binoculars, scanning the jagged shadows of the surrounding cliffs. The ANSPY-6 radar showed only the granite walls of the fjord and the distant, slow-moving blip of a commercial fishing trawler 6 miles to the west. But the trawler was holding a stationary position that perfectly mirrored the movements of the current, likely acting as the command and control platform for the divers below. The standoff was entering its second hour. The pressure inside the Combat Information Center was a physical weight. Every sailor knew that. A single command could end the lives of the men below the hull, but it would also end the peace that had held in the Arctic for decades. The United States Navy pride was on the line, but so was the safety of the 300 crew members currently sitting on top of a potential explosion. Admiral, Vance said, her eyes fixed. On the screen showing the divers near the rudder, the intruders have begun to prime the second device. We are no longer in a phase of observation. If we do not act within the next 15 minutes, we risk losing steering or propulsion. I am requesting permission to transition to active deterrent measures. The response from Stuttgart was delayed by a second of satellite latency. Commander, you are authorized to utilize non-lethal deterrents to force the divers to surface. You are authorized to use the ship's security swim team for hull interdiction. However, you are to hold fire unless the divers display hostile intent with small arms, or if a detonation is imminent. The Norwegians are 5 minutes from your position. Wait for the KV Nordkapp to establish a perimeter. Vance closed the channel and turned to her tactical action officer. The time for diplomacy was shrinking. The crew waited in the heavy silence of their battle stations, the only sound the low hum of the cooling fans and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the ship's active sonar pings hitting the hull. Outside, the cold Norwegian wind whipped across the gray water, carrying the sharp scent of salt and the silent promise of a coming storm. The Russian divers were still there, clinging to the steel like leeches, unaware that the rules of the engagement were about to change. 2:45 in the morning. The cold surface of the Ofot-fjord was suddenly broken by the deployment of the first active deterrents from the fantail of the USS Gravely. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of the Navy's master-at-arms community, stood on the narrow walkway at the stern of the ship. He was flanked by 2 members of the Security Reaction Force, both wearing heavy tactical vests and night vision goggles that cast a ghostly green glow over their features. In his hand, Rodriguez held a Mark III Alpha II concussion grenade. This was not a fragmentation weapon designed to shred targets with shrapnel. To a diver, the detonation felt like being hit in every square inch of the body by a sledgehammer. Drop 1, Commander Vance ordered over the tactical radio circuit. Rodriguez pulled the pin and dropped the heavy cylinder into the black water. It sank rapidly, the fuse timed to detonate, at a depth of 6 meters, exactly level with the ship's primary propeller shafts. For 5 seconds, there was only the sound of the wind whipping against the ship's superstructure. Then, a dull, heavy thump vibrated through the steel of the hull. A plume of white water, barely visible in the darkness, erupted 30 feet behind the ship. Inside the Combat Information Center, the remote-operated vehicle feed flickered with static from the shockwave. When the image stabilized, the tactical team saw the immediate effect of the blast. The 2 Russian Spetsnaz divers near the starboard shaft had been slammed against the steel skin of the ship. Their limbs flailed as the concussive force compressed the air in their lungs and sinus cavities. One diver lost his grip on the magnetic tether and tumbled backward into the dark void of the fjord, his handheld propulsion vehicle spinning uselessly as it sank. Contact 1 is adrift, the remote-operated vehicle operator reported. Contact 2 is attempting to re-secure himself to the rudder assembly. They are not surfacing. The Russian divers were proving their elite status. Despite the agonizing pressure of the concussion grenades, they were refusing to abandon their mission. The diver near the rudder reached for the rectangular nylon bag containing the second limpet mine. His movements were slower now, jerky and pained, but his intent remained clear. He was going to finish the job before the Americans could stop him. Drop 2 and 3, staggered intervals, Vance commanded. Her jaw was set tight. We need them. Off that hull now. Rodriguez dropped 2 more concussion grenades in quick succession. One off the port quarter and one directly front, over the stern. The twin detonations shook the USS Gravely, a series of violent shudders that could be felt in the soles of every sailor's boots from the bridge down to the engine room. The sound was a visceral, metallic crack that echoed off the granite walls of the Norwegian fjord. The underwater camera showed the second diver being violently jarred away from the rudder. The overpressure was too much for even a Spetsnaz operator to endure at such close range. Both divers were now forced away from the ship's skin, hovering 5 meters off the hull, their black forms illuminated by the harsh, LEDs of the drone. They were disoriented, but they were still armed. As the divers drifted, a new contact appeared on the ship's surface search radar. The KV Nordkapp, the Norwegian Coast Guard's ice-strengthened patrol vessel, was now only 2 miles away and closing fast. The Norwegian ship energized its own massive searchlights, adding a secondary layer of blinding white light to the scene. The fjord, which had been a place of silent shadows only an hour before, was now a theater of high-intensity, white light, and rhythmic underwater explosions. On the bridge of the USS Gravely, the signalman reported a light flashing from the distant Russian trawler. It was a rapid, erratic signal in Morse code, a desperate command being sent to the men in the water. "They're calling them back," the tactical action officer observed. "Or they're giving the order to detonate," Vance countered. She turned to the security lead. "Get the swim team in the water. I want those divers intercepted before they reach that trawler, and I want those mines neutralized. We are not letting them leave a gift behind on our rudder." The logistics of the operation were shifting. The security swim team, 4 highly trained Navy divers, were already in their gear on the midships boat deck. They checked their underwater communication sets and their non-lethal capture nets. They were about to enter a 2°C environment to engage the most dangerous divers in the world. The air smelled of salt, cold grease, and the sharp chemical scent of the grenade propellant. The standoff was over. The physical interdiction had begun. 2:50 in the morning. The midships boat deck of the destroyer DDG-107. The security swim team, 4 United States Navy divers, sat on the edge of the sponson, their heavy fins dangling over the black, churning water. They were equipped with the Mark 16 underwater breathing apparatus, a closed-circuit system that, like the Russian gear, produced no bubbles. Each man carried a waterproofed Glock 17 pistol in a specialized thigh holster and a serrated titanium dive knife strapped to the calf. The air on deck was a freezing mist that clung to their rubberized suits, smelling of salt spray and the heavy diesel exhaust from the ship's auxiliary engines. Green light. Divers away, the dive supervisor commanded over the localized radio net. The 4 men rolled backward into the Ofot-fjord. The shock of the 2-degree water was an immediate, stinging assault on the small patches of exposed skin around their masks. They descended rapidly, following the glowing green chem lights attached to the hull of the USS Gravely. Below them, the world was a silent, pressurized void of emerald and black, illuminated only by the narrow, flickering beams of their high-intensity underwater flashlights. In the Combat Information Center, Commander Vance watched the split-screen display. One side showed the remote-operated vehicle's feed of the Russian divers, who were now struggling to regain their buoyancy after the concussion blasts. The other side showed the tactical plot of her own divers closing the distance. The American team moved in a tactical diamond formation, gliding through the water with powerful, rhythmic kicks. Team leader to bridge. The lead diver's voice crackled through the underwater acoustic phone, sounding metallic and distorted. "We have visual on 2 intruders. They are approximately 30 feet off the rudder assembly. They appear disoriented but are regrouping. Intercept and neutralize," Vance ordered. "Secure the intruders. Do not let them reach that trawler." The American divers transitioned from a transit swim to a combat intercept. They utilized their handheld sonar units to lock onto the acoustic signatures of the Russian rebreathers. The distance closed to 20 feet, then 10. The Russian Spetsnaz, sensing the change in the water's pressure and the flicker of approaching lights, turned to face their pursuers. The lead Russian diver reached for his hip, pulling a specialized underwater weapon, a 4-barreled SPP-1 pistol, designed to fire steel darts through the high-density medium of the water. This was the moment the standoff transitioned into a direct engagement. The Russian was not surrendering. He was choosing to fight in the freezing dark of the fjord. "Contact has drawn a weapon," the technician shouted in the Combat Information Center. The American team leader didn't hesitate. He slammed his propulsion vehicle into high gear, closing the gap in a burst of speed that caught the Russian Kosses off guard. He drove his shoulder into the Russian's chest, the impact sending a dull thud through the water that was picked up by the ship's sensitive hull-mounted hydrophones. The two men became a tangled knot of black rubber and thrashing limbs, silhouetted against the massive, unmoving steel of the destroyer's rudder. As they wrestled, the second Russian diver attempted to intervene, but he was intercepted by the other three Americans. They worked in a coordinated strike, one man pinning the Russian's arms, while the others moved to secure him with heavy-duty zip ties. The water was filled with the frantic, silent energy of a life-or-death struggle. The silt from the fjord floor began to rise in a gray cloud, obscuring the camera's view and leaving the tactical team on the ship to rely on the frantic audio of the diver's breathing. "We have one secured," the team leader gasped into his mask. "The other is fighting. He's trying to reach the mine on the rudder." The American diver saw the Russian's hand stretching out, fingers clawing at the magnetic housing of the explosive device. If he triggered the manual bypass, the mine would detonate instantly, killing everyone within 50 feet and crippling the USS Gravely. The struggle was no longer about a capture. It was about preventing a catastrophe. The American diver drew his knife, the blade catching the light of a nearby strobe, and prepared for the final, violent resolution beneath the hull. 2:55 in the morning. The dark, pressurized world beneath the stern of the destroyer, DDG-107, became a theater of high-velocity violence. The American team leader, his left arm locked around the Russian's neck, could feel the frantic vibration of the intruder's heart. Through the thick layers of their combat suits, the water around them was a chaotic swirl of gray silt and silver bubbles, illuminated by the erratic, sweeping beams of tactical lights. The two men were no longer soldiers in a Cold War. They were two predators fighting for air and life in a freezing emerald void. The Russian diver reached for the holster on his right thigh and squeezed the trigger of his SPP-1 underwater pistol. The firing pin struck, and a 4-inch steel dart shrieked through the high-density water, leaving a brief trail of cavitating bubbles in its wake. The dart punched straight through the outer layer of the American-led diver's left shoulder, tearing the vulcanized rubber and burying itself deep in the muscle. A plume of dark, thick blood erupted into the green water, blooming like a cloud of ink in the beam of the flashlight. The American diver did not scream. He could not. He grunted, the sound a wet thud inside his full face mask, and kicked hard with his fins to close the final 3 feet of distance. He drove his titanium dive knife into the Russian's air supply regulator, the metal teeth shredding the high-pressure hose with a sickening mechanical rip. A violent explosion of silver bubbles erupted from the Russian's chest as the compressed oxygen escaped all at once. The force of the depressurization throwing the Spetsnaz operator backward against the cold steel of the destroyer's hull. The Russian clawed at his throat, his mask filling with freezing brine as he spun out of control, sinking toward the dark silt of the fjord floor 30 meters below. The second Russian diver, seeing his partner neutralized, did not retreat. He drew his own combat knife and lunged toward the American team, but he was intercepted by the 3 remaining Navy divers. They moved with the cold efficiency of a shark pack. One diver grabbed the Russian's legs, while another used a specialized acoustic stun baton to deliver a high-frequency pulse directly to the intruder's chest. The Russian's body went rigid as the electrical charge disrupted his nervous system, his knife slipping from his gloved hand and vanishing into the depths. Within 10 seconds, he was bound with heavy-duty reinforced zip ties, his arms secured behind his back and his propulsion unit disabled. Above the surface, the KV Nordkapp had arrived. The Norwegian vessel moved with deceptive speed for its size, its bow cutting through the choppy water of the fjord. The Norwegians energized their long-range acoustic device, sending a focused beam of sound toward the Russian trawler 5 miles away. The sound was a high-pitched, agonizing shriek that traveled for miles, a sovereign warning to the Russian command ship that their presence was no longer tolerated. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Gravely, the tactical team watched the feed from the remote-operated vehicle as it hovered near the rudder. The two Russian divers were now under the control of the American swim team. One was being towed to the surface for immediate medical treatment for the pressure-related injuries caused by his gear failure, while the second was being hauled toward the ship's midships boat deck as a prisoner. "Status on the mines?" Commander Vance asked. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the low murmur of the room. She was looking at the screen where a single rectangular device remained attached to the bronze propeller shaft. "Ma'am, the first mine is secure on the hull, but it appears to be on a countdown timer." The remote-operated vehicle operator replied. "The second mine is adrift, currently sinking about 40 feet off the port quarter. We need to get EOD in the water now." The heat of the combat was fading, replaced by the cold, clinical terror of an active explosive device attached to the ship's propulsion system. The internal air of the USS Gravely felt thinner, the catchant smell of recycled oxygen and nervous sweat more pronounced. Every sailor on board knew that, while the divers were gone, the threat had only just begun. The ship was still sitting on a fuse, and the timer was ticking away. In the silent, freezing dark of the North Atlantic, 3:05 in the morning, the destroyer USS Gravely remained at general quarters, but the nature of the threat had shifted from a human adversary to a mechanical one. The two Russian Spetsnaz divers had been pulled from the water at the midships boat deck. One was conscious but silent, his hands zip-tied and his eyes fixed on the deck plating. The other lay on a specialized medical litter, his chest heaving as the ship's corpsman worked to stabilize a suspected arterial gas embolism caused by his shredded regulator. The air in the hangar was sharp with the scent of salt water, wet rubber, and the clinical, metallic smell of emergency medical supplies. "Bridge. This is combat," the tactical action officer reported. "The primary threat is now the two explosive devices. Remote-operated Vehicle 1 has a visual on the mine attached to the starboard propeller shaft. We have confirmed a pulsing red LED indicator on the housing. It is an active timer." Commander Vance stood on the bridge, her hands gripping the cold steel of the forward console. To her left, the Norwegian Coast Guard vessel KV Nordkapp had moved into a blocking position 300 meters off the Gravely's stern. The Norwegians had deployed their own fast interceptor craft to create a 1,000-meter exclusion zone, effectively sealing off this section of the fjord from any interference by the Russian trawler. "Status of our explosive ordnance disposal team?" Vance asked. "Lieutenant Chen and his team are on the fantail, ma'am," the officer of the deck replied. "They are prepping the Mark 16 Mod 1 underwater breathing apparatus. They will be in the water in 3 minutes." The ship's specialized explosive ordnance disposal unit, a 4-man team from Mobile Diving, and Salvage Unit 2 was moving with a calm, practiced, deliberate speed. They did not rush. In their world, a rush was a death sentence. Lieutenant Chen, the team leader, checked the seals on his dry suit. Beside him, his lead technician was preparing a POSIT, specialized toolkit that included non-magnetic ceramic knives, a portable X-ray imager, and a high-frequency acoustic disruptor. The temperature on the deck had dropped to 1 degree Celsius. The wind was whipping off the glacier-carved peaks of the fjord, carrying a fine, freezing mist that coated the EOD equipment in a thin layer of ice. The sailor's breath came out in thick, white plumes. "Diving team, you are cleared for water entry." Vance's voice came over the deck speakers. "Priority 1 is the device on the hull. Priority 2 is locating the adrift mine before it strikes the fjord floor or the anchor chain." The EOD divers rolled into the water. Unlike the security swim team that had engaged in the earlier combat, these men moved with a slow, surgical grace. They descended toward the stern, their lights cutting through the murky green water. The remote-operated vehicle backed away to give them room, its camera capturing the eerie scene. The massive bronze propeller, a masterpiece of engineering weighing thousands of pounds, was now shadowed by the small, black, rectangular box of the Russian limpet mine. Team leader has the device. Chen's voice sounded through the acoustic phone, steady and rhythmic. It is a Russian EPM series magnetic mine. It appears to have a dual trigger system. One is a digital countdown timer, and the other is a vibration sensor. If the ship starts its engines, it blows. Can you neutralize the vibration sensor? The tactical action officer asked from the Combat Information Center. Negative, Chen replied. The casing is anti-tamper. I am going to attempt a surgical separation of the magnetic base from the hull using a high-pressure water jet cutter. If I can get it off the ship, we can let it sink to the bottom and detonate it remotely. The tension throughout the ship was palpable. 300 sailors were sitting on top of a weapon designed to tear a hole in their hull, waiting for a man in a rubber suit to perform a delicate operation in freezing darkness. In the engineering spaces, the black shoe sailors stood by their valves and monitors, the silence of the stopped engines feeling like a heavy shroud. As Chen began the delicate process of setting up the water jet, the second EOD pair reported a discovery. Using their handheld sonar, they had located the second mine. It had snagged on a submerged rock shelf 40 meters below the surface, barely 50 meters from the ship's bow. We have the second device, the diver reported. It's wedged in the rocks. It didn't detonate on impact, but it's unstable. The current is shifting it. Stabilize it, Vance ordered. Chen, you have 10 minutes before the tide turns and the ship starts to swing. If that hull moves against the mine, we lose the stern. The air in the Combat Information Center felt static, charged with the collective breath of the crew. Outside, the fjord was a picture of serenity. The northern lights began to shimmer in, curtains of green and violet high above the masts of the USS Gravely. But 10 meters below the waterline, the fate of the destroyer rested on the steady hands of a single diver and a thin stream of pressurized water. 3:15 in the morning. 10 meters below the surface of the Ofot-fjord, the world was reduced to the space between Lieutenant Chen's gloved fingers and the cold steel of the destroyer's hull. The explosive ordnance disposal team leader felt the rhythmic vibration of his own heart, a slow and steady thumping that seemed to echo inside his Mark 16 diving helmet. In front of him, the Russian EPM series limpet mine was a malevolent black box, its magnetic feet locked onto the bronze propeller shaft with hundreds of pounds of pressure. The small red light on its face pulsed every 2 seconds, a digital heartbeat that signaled a countdown the Americans could not see. Cutting rig is positioned, Chen whispered into his acoustic microphone. His voice was transmitted through the water to the receiving hydrophones on the hull, and then up to the Combat Information Center. Starting the high-pressure water jet. Stand by. The water jet cutter was a specialized tool, a portable unit that used a mixture of high-pressure water and fine abrasive garnet to slice through metal without generating the heat or friction that could trigger a vibration sensor. It produced a low, hissing hum that vibrated through Chen's hands. He moved the nozzle with surgical precision, beginning to carve through the specialized magnetic mounting brackets that held the mine to the ship. Inside the ship, the silence was absolute. In the engineering spaces directly above the propeller shaft, the sailors held their breath, their eyes fixed on the overhead pipes. They knew that if the mine detonated, the steel above them would turn into a spray of lethal fragments in a fraction of a second. The smell of cold grease and hydraulic oil felt thick in the stagnant air of the darkened compartment. 5 minutes remaining on the primary timer. The remote-operated vehicle operator reported from the control booth. The red light has transitioned to a rapid flicker. Lieutenant, you are running out of time. Steady, Chen replied. He didn't look at the timer. He watched the thin, high-velocity stream of water as it ate through the last 2 inches of the Russian mounting bracket. The abrasive garnet created a tiny cloud of gray dust that was whisked away by the slow-moving current of the fjord. Suddenly, the last of the metal gave way. The magnetic seal broke with a dull, metallic clack that felt like a gunshot in the silent water. The limpet mine, now disconnected from the hull but still active, began to drift. Chen moved instantly, his hands catching the heavy rectangular box before it could tumble into the propeller blades. He cradled it against his chest like a child, his fins kicking hard to push him away from the steel skin of the USS Gravely. "Devices clear of the hull," Chen gasped, his breathing suddenly ragged. "I am moving to the drop zone. Signal the second team." 80 feet away, near the bow, the second pair of explosive ordnance disposal divers had successfully stabilized the adrift mine using a specialized heavy lift bag. They inflated the bag just enough to keep the mine from grinding against the rocks, then tethered it to a heavy concrete anchor they had dropped onto the seafloor. "Both devices are ready for remote disposal," the team lead reported. The USS Gravely did not wait. As soon as the divers were clear of the blast radius, Commander Vance ordered the ship to weigh anchor. The massive chains rattled through the hawse pipes, the sound like thunder echoing through the fjord. The gas turbine engines roared to life, the exhaust heat shimmering in the freezing Norwegian air as the destroyer began to move slowly toward the mouth of the fjord, putting distance between itself and the two active Russian mines. At 3:30 in the morning, the order was given. The explosive ordnance disposal team on the fantail triggered the acoustic detonators. The surface of the fjord erupted. A massive plume of white water and gray silt shot 50 feet into the air as the two mines detonated simultaneously on the seafloor. The shockwaves slammed into the stern of the departing USS Gravely, a violent, bone-shaking thump that rattled every light fixture on the ship. A secondary explosion followed seconds later, the sound of the underwater rock shelf collapsing into the deep trench of the fjord. The black water churned and boiled, filled with the debris of the Russian sabotage attempt. Above the water, the halogen searchlights of the Norwegian Coast Guard vessel KV Nordkapp swept over the coast, rising smoke and foam. The threat to the hull was gone. The mines were neutralized, and the USS Gravely was moving under its own power. But as the ship cleared the inner fjord, the radar operators in the Combat Information Center saw the Russian trawler finally turning its bow toward the open sea. The saboteurs had failed, but they were retreating back into the shadows of the Arctic, leaving behind a trail of spent explosives and the beginning of a cold, dangerous new chapter in the North Atlantic. 4:30 in the morning. The gray light of a northern dawn began to bleed over the jagged peaks of the Norwegian mountains, casting long, cold shadows across the water of the Ofot-fjord. The destroyer, USS Gravely, designated DDG-107, was now 6 miles from its original anchorage, steaming toward the open waters of the Norwegian Sea at a steady 15 knots. The ship was no longer at general quarters, but the crew remained in a state of heightened modified alert. On the bridge, the smell of stale coffee and the ozone of the electronic consoles hung in the air, a testament to the 4-hour struggle that had just concluded beneath the hull. Commander Vance stood on the starboard bridge wing, the freezing wind biting at her face as she watched the KV Nordkapp pull alongside. The transfer of the 2 Russian prisoners was being conducted with the clinical efficiency of a high-stakes diplomatic exchange. The divers, still in their black vulcanized rubber suits but stripped of their specialized equipment, were moved via a rigid-hull inflatable boat to the Norwegian vessel. They would be processed by the Norwegian Intelligence Service under the watchful eyes of the NATO alliance. The cost of the engagement was now being tallied in the quiet rooms of the ship. One United States Navy diver, the team leader who had engaged in the underwater struggle, was in stable condition in the ship's sickbay with a through-and-through wound to his left shoulder. He would be medevaced to a land-based hospital in Tromsø within the hour. The ship itself had sustained minor cosmetic damage to the bronze propeller shaft and several deep gouges in the hull plating from the magnetic grips, but the structural integrity of the billion-dollar vessel remained 100% intact. The intelligence hull, however, was significant. The security, swim team, and the remote-operated vehicle had recovered a wealth of Russian hardware. 2 advanced underwater propulsion vehicles, a specialized SPP-1 underwater pistol, and the remains of the magnetic mounting brackets from the neutralized mines. Most importantly, The high-definition video footage from the ship's sensors provided undeniable proof of the Russian Federation's violation of Norwegian sovereignty and its direct attack on a United States Navy asset. As the USS Gravely reached the mouth of the fjord, the communications suite received the first official response from Moscow. The Russian Ministry of Defense issued a curt, three-sentence statement denying any involvement in the incident. They claimed that the trawler in the area was a civilian vessel performing routine maritime research, and that any underwater anomalies were likely the result of NATO's own provocative exercises. It was a predictable lie, a standard piece of geopolitical theater that fooled no one in the Combat Information Center. Let them deny it, Vance said to her executive officer as they watched the Russian trawler vanish into a bank of fog on the horizon. We have the sensors, we have the gear, and we have their men. The world will see exactly what happened in this fjord. The mission of the USS Gravely was far from over. As part of Carrier Strike Group 8, the destroyer was scheduled to join the USS Harry S. Truman for integrated strike warfare drills in the Barents Sea. The incident in the Ofot-fjord was a stark reminder that the Arctic was no longer a sanctuary, but a front line in a shadow war that was rapidly heating up. The ship's 321 sailors returned to their normal watch-standing rotations, but the atmosphere on board had fundamentally changed. They had been tested in the dark, in a confined space where the advantage belonged to the intruder, and they had won. The professionalism of the side, sonar technicians, the bravery of the security swim team, and the steady hands of the explosive ordnance disposal unit had saved the dock ship from a catastrophe that could have triggered a global conflict. As the destroyer hit the swell of the open sea, the bow rose and fell with a rhythmic, powerful motion, throwing plumes of white spray across the forward 5-inch gun mount. The USS Gravely was a hunter again, its radar sweeping the cold northern sky and its sonar listening to the deep, silent reaches of the Atlantic. The standoff in the fjord was over, but the watch continued. In the logbook for the 29th of March, 2026, the entry was brief and professional. It noted the time the anchor was weighed, the neutralization of 2 hostile devices, and the safe departure of the vessel. It did not mention the fear, the cold, or the adrenaline of the fight. It simply stated that the ship was on station and ready for all tasks.